We're now 3 weeks into this war, and we're starting to see cracks. I've been tracking this war since day one. You can see the daily updates in my shorts. But here's week 3, day 18 to 24. This week, we saw the first real break inside Trump's team. Joe Kent, head of the National Counterterrorism Center and a longtime Trump ally, resigned, saying he could not support sending more Americans into this war. At the same time, Trump lashed out at NATO allies because no one is stepping forward to support the US. From their perspective, they weren't consulted beforehand, and they don't see this as their war. We also heard again from Iran's new supreme leader, although he still hasn't been seen in public. I also want to draw attention to Lebanon because around 1 million people have now been displaced as Israeli strikes expand, including central Lebanon, including central Beirut, far away from the Hezbollah strongholds. So here's what you missed this week. Trump's counterterrorism chief resigned, claiming the US was pulled into this war by Israel and its powerful lobby. So on day 18 of the Iran war, it's the first major crack inside the Trump administration since the start of the war. Joe Kent, the head of the National Counterterrorism Center, is stepping down, but Kent is part of a growing America First movement that seems to be losing patience. Now, he's a longtime supporter of President Trump, and he made that clear in his resignation letter that he posted, but he's also not holding back. He says high-ranking Israeli officials and part of the American media deployed a misinformation campaign to convince the president that Iran posed an immediate threat. This echo chamber was used to deceive you into believing that Iran posed an imminent threat to the United States, and that should you strike now, there was a clear path to a swift victory. This was a lie. And then he compares it to the same tactics used to pull the US into the Iraq war. But this is personal because he says he's been deployed 11 times, lost his wife in war, and cannot support sending more Americans into another conflict. So Trump was asked about this today, and here's what he said.
I always thought he was a nice guy, but I always thought he was weak on security, very weak on security. I read a statement, I realized that it's a good thing that he's out because he said that Iran was not a threat. Iran was a threat. Every country realized what a threat Iran was.
No surprise, the president remains defiant when he's criticized, but Kent is not alone because more MAGA voices are speaking out, like Joe Rogan, who says he feels betrayed. These are people who voted for Trump because he promised to lower costs and keep the US out of forever wars. And now there are estimates that this war is costing American taxpayers up to $1.5 billion every single day. Oil and gas prices are heading higher as the largest gas field on earth was struck. On day 19 of the war, Israel says it hit Iran's huge Pars gas field with US consent. This is a gas field that Iran shares with Qatar, and it's the largest natural gas field in the world. It holds roughly 10% of known gas reserves. So Israel targeting that field affects not just Iran's economy, it has global implications. Since the strike, Brent crude prices jumped higher than $108. And now Iran is warning its neighbors that their energy installations will be targeted in the coming hours. If you're not watching the intensity of Israeli bombardment in Lebanon, watch this. Israel says it wants to destroy Hezbollah's capabilities, but they're hitting densely populated areas in central Beirut, not just Hezbollah strongholds in southern Lebanon and Beirut's southern suburbs. And another major escalation is Israeli warplanes are targeting bridges over the Litani River. Now, by doing that, the Israeli military is trying to cut off southern Lebanon from the rest of the country. So that would make it far more difficult for civilians to flee north and for humanitarian aid to reach the south. So again, Israel says it's targeting Hezbollah, but this is Lebanon's wider population that's being impacted. The UN's humanitarian office says more than 1 million people have now been displaced in Lebanon. Now, this is a country of under 6 million, so that's nearly 20% of the population that's been displaced. Only about 132,000 are in UN-run shelters. And according to Lebanon's health ministry, more than 900 people have been killed now, many of them children, and over 2,000 injured. Oil prices are surging, but this is no longer just about the Strait of Hormuz. Let me explain. It's day 20 of the war, and yes, the Strait of Hormuz is still critical because roughly a fifth of the world's oil passes through it. But what's getting less attention is Iran is targeting alternative routes as well. Saudi Arabia and Oman have tried to use these outer routes in the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean to bypass the Strait of Hormuz. But Iran has targeted these too. And although these facilities are technically still operational, they are no longer risk-free, secure routes. So even the backup options are now under pressure. And this is going beyond oil now too, because Qatar's natural gas infrastructure has taken a massive hit after Iranian strikes, and those were in retaliation for Israel's strike on Iran's South Pars gas field. Now, Qatar says some of its gas capacity is now offline, and it could take a while to fix, maybe even years. So this is no longer just about blocking routes, it's about dismantling the energy infrastructure itself. What's the difference between oil and natural gas? Oil fuels transport. So when you see Brent crude prices go up, that's the price you will feel at the pump. And this is about global supply. So even if the US and Trump say there's lots of oil supply in the US, oil prices are determined by the global oil pool, which is now down because of the war. Liquefied natural gas, or LNG, powers things like electricity, heating, industry. So that means keeping your lights on, heating homes, running factories. The US and Qatar are two of the world's biggest gas producers, but in Europe, gas markets were already tight because of the loss of Russian gas during the Ukraine war. And Qatar became an alternative, so now supplies are even tighter. A message from Iran's supreme leader reports of thousands of US Marines deploying, and the UK says the US can use its bases. Here's a quick recap of the main stories on day 21 of the Iran war. First, marking Persian New Year, Mustafa Khamenei issued a written address claiming the enemy has been defeated even as US and Israeli strikes on Iran continue. Notably, this was read on state TV. He still hasn't been seen or heard publicly since the war began, and he's widely believed to be injured. Second, the US is deploying thousands of Marines in the Middle East, according to multiple reports. Their exact role is still unclear, but it comes as a new Reuters poll shows that just 7% of all Americans support a large-scale ground war. But among Republicans, 63% support sending special forces. Third, the UK says the US can use British bases to strike Iranian missile sites targeting shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. Now, the UK says it will not take part in offensive operations, framing them as collective self-defense. But Iran warns that any US use of British military bases would amount to the UK's participation in aggression. Is the war winding down? Trump sounded more upbeat than usual today, but there are some buts. Here's a quick catch-up of days 22 to 24 in case you missed them. So over the weekend, there was a lot of heated rhetoric from both Trump and Iran. On Saturday, Trump set a 48-hour deadline for Iran to fully open the Strait of Hormuz, or the US would, quote, obliterate Iran's power plants. Iran responding, saying it would strike the energy and water systems of the Gulf neighbors in retaliation. And the IRGC spokesperson even trolled Trump in one of his messages.
Hey Trump, you are fired. You are familiar with this sentence. Thank you for your attention to this matter, the central headquarters of Khatam al-Anbiya.
Well, Monday evening US time was the deadline, but Monday morning, Trump called off the strikes for 5 days, saying the US and Iran were having productive talks about ending the war.
We have had very, very strong talks. We'll see where they lead. We have major points of agreement. I would say almost all points of agreement. Otherwise, we'll just keep bombing our little hearts out.
Iran said there were no talks happening, direct or indirect. But then there were reports that Pakistan, Egypt, and other countries had been relaying messages between the US and Iran, although it's not clear who they can actually talk to in Iran now. So that US ultimatum is off for now. Analysts are calling this another case of taco. Trump always chickens out. Iran will see this as a win, but for the Gulf countries, this will be a huge relief. So, does it look like the war is actually winding down? Well, Trump has to find a way out. But on Friday, the US deployed about 2,500 more Marines, which suggests this war could still expand, potentially even with troops on the ground. And then there's Israel. Even if the US wants to wind things down, can it actually control Israel? Because Israel wants to substantially weaken Iran's regime while its intense bombardment of Lebanon continues.